GoLocal Live. I'm Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. I want to thank Courtney Nicolato, CEO of United Way of Rhode Island. She joined us earlier to talk about 401 Gives, Day of Giving in Rhode Island. It's got to be about $1.5 million in the door already. The goal is $4 million. If you haven't given, try at 401gives.org and make a donation to your favorite nonprofits in Rhode Island. They could use the help. Let's go down to the University of Virginia. Jennifer Lawless, she is the chair of the Political Science Department. Professor, thanks so much for joining us.
I am happy to be here.
Great. Let's go across the globe over to Eastern Europe, the Ukraine. Very interesting times right there. Give us your overview of sort of how President Biden has been managing this conflict and whether or not it's having any impact on Americans' perception of how well he's doing as president.
It's really interesting because it's hard to find specific critiques of the Biden administration and how they've handled it. They've done an excellent job making sure that the NATO alliance stays intact. They've done a very good job, I think, communicating to the American people what this war means for pocketbook issues in the United States. Yet, Biden's approval ratings are continuing to go lower and lower, and a recent poll actually finds that a greater percentage of Americans thinks that Zelensky is doing a good job than Biden. And so we're in this very bizarre situation where it seems like no matter what the administration does, they're unable to claim credit in a meaningful way because of inflation. In terms of the war itself, it's difficult to know what to think because the information coming out of Russia and from Putin and his spokespeople is just not accurate. At the same time that they're saying they're going to draw down and redeploy some forces, they're actively bombing the places where they said they were going to be drawing down. It doesn't seem like there's an end in sight. Discussions of ceasefires are, happening simultaneous to heightened bombs. So it's very difficult to know what to think.
Joe Biden's decreasing popularity. He has not dropped below Putin, though, correct?
So far.
So far. It's obviously a wildly complex scenario over there. And the Ukrainian military seem to be, I don't want to say in control at some degree, but certainly holding their own. I mean, I can remember listening to CNN and the talking retired generals saying that in all likelihood, Kyiv would fall in 4 to 7 days. It's now 6 weeks later, and if anyone has the upper hand, it's the Ukrainians. Does this have a positive outcome both for the Ukrainians and for America?
Well, I think it's positive for the Ukrainians in that they've definitely launched a military and a set of responses that far exceeded the global community's expectations as well as their own citizens. And so I think that makes it more likely for them to dig in their heels and say that they're going to fight as much as they possibly can. It does also, I think, advantage the world in that because they've been able to put up a fight, the odds of them being able to say that they're going to, relinquish any territory become virtually zero. And so this is not going to be a situation where Putin can slowly grab more and more territory. The other thing that's kind of surprising, and again, we have to be leery about Russian intelligence and what's coming out of Russia, but the reports last night and early this morning were that Putin and the military are drafting upwards of 100,000 additional soldiers because their military presence has basically been decimated, at least in terms of their ground forces. And so, I think that it sends a signal to the world and especially to the NATO alliance that investing in Ukraine and working with them to push back Putin is money well spent.
Let's talk a little bit about inflation. Inflation both appears to be going up month after month. The president, in an effort to stem the increased cost of gasoline and home heating oil, announced yesterday that he would release a massive amount of oil. The amount of oil on a per-day basis is actually about 1/20th of what the country uses. So I'm not sure how much fiscal impact. What's the strategy there?
I think it's twofold. The first is to communicate to the citizens of this country that the administration is on top of this and is going to do whatever it can and whatever is in its power to curb these crazy prices. So, it's just demonstrating that they're willing to take the steps that are open to them to take. The second is to actually alleviate the burden. Now, it's spring, it's going to be summer, heating costs are going to be lower than they've been. I mean, if there was ever a time for these prices to surge, now is better than, December and January. But I do think that this is a situation where it's up to the president and the administration to do whatever they can and to communicate that, because otherwise, I think everyday Americans are walking around thinking, my paycheck went up a little bit, but the prices that I'm paying, not only for gas and oil, but for everything, have gone up twice as much.
Yeah, now interest rates are going up. Now that's intentional by the Federal Reserve. Jerome Powell has said, listen, we're going to be aggressive in trying to curtail the growth of inflation. It is now starting to impact, to some degree, the housing market. Interest rates for a 30-year mortgage on average are about 5%, the highest in the past 4 or 5 years. I'm not sure how much impact. We could have a whole other discussion about whether or not it's going to curtail the amount of demand that there is in the housing market. But, playing with interest rates and inflation can get complicated. Zandy from Moody's was on this morning saying, listen, there's a 1 in 3 chance that these market conditions could spark a recession. For the president, for the country, which is worse, inflation or recession?
Look, I mean, you really don't want either, but by tweaking the interest rates a little bit, you can see what the outcomes are, and ultimately, if you wind up moving toward recessionary behavior, you can pull back. So I think it's the right strategy, given that they really can't get a handle on inflation any other way.
And is this White House, part of the problem with this White House seems to be there's tremendous job numbers this morning. I think it was 431,000 new jobs. Unemployment now down to pre-pandemic levels, 3.7% unemployment, more than 10 million vacant jobs going unfilled because there's just not the workforce for it. Why doesn't the White House talk about these things? It is at least everyone. I mean, you can argue a lot of things about how damaging the inflationary conditions are, but at least everyone's got a job. They've got for the most part, they've got a roof over their head. They're feeding their children. They're getting to work. All those positive things of when people are working.
Yeah, it's so the obvious critique is that this is a mistake, and that the administration should be highlighting the good things that they've been able to do, despite the fact that they're constrained by a lot of economic problems that they really can't control and that are beyond their ability to manage on a day-to-day basis, like inflation. The problem with this, and there are lots of studies in political science and psychology that speak to this, is it's difficult for people to imagine a counterfactual. And so what would happen is Biden would have to make the case that things would be so much worse if the jobs numbers weren't what they were, that things would be so much worse if employment were higher, that things would be so much worse if we had fewer vacancies and people were looking for jobs. And so that's not to say it's not worth a shot, but it is difficult to get people to feel enthusiastic about something when it's contingent on making them imagine something else.
They have definitely surrendered to that mindset because they don't have a good news press conference. And, I get the feed, I get the notifications of when they're having a press conference, and it's almost always playing defense rather than playing offense. So we'll see from there. Let's go over to the President's Supreme Court nominee, Joe Manchin, late last week, over the weekend, confirmed that he would vote for her. Earlier this week, Republican Susan Collins from Maine, kind of the last of the moderate Republicans in the United States Senate, announced she would be voting for her. Your thoughts? Do any other Republicans come? Does Mitt Romney come? Does Murkowski come? Any others?
Well, first, let me say that I don't really think that Susan Collins demonstrated any degree of bravery here. She announced that she was supporting her once her vote was no longer pivotal. And she's not up for re-election for another 5 years.
So Susan Collins is in your favorite members of the United States Senate list, right?
I'm gonna continue. So anyway, I think that it's possible that Lisa Murkowski or Mitt Romney could support. It's probably unlikely at this point. Murkowski's up for what will be a difficult re-election campaign, and Romney's vote doesn't really matter here, so it's unclear that there's much for him to gain by supporting her. What is important is because of the Susan Collins vote, Joe Biden can say that this is still a bipartisan confirmation process, and he's not going to have to go down this path of saying that he couldn't actually even get one Republican to support his nominee. So it's obviously going to be incredibly close. All of the confirmation hearings as of late have been, but by having at least one Republican, I think he saves quite a bit of face.
Let's jump over yesterday. Donald Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, married to his favorite child, appeared before the January 6th commission and testified reportedly for 6 hours, and reportedly did not take the fifth, answered questions. What do we know, and what is this an indication of?
So we know nothing about the content of his remarks, but we do know that Democrats on the committee have said that the information that he provided was quite helpful, and specifically helpful regarding the 8 hours that seem to have gone missing in terms of phone transcripts and, accounting for the president's time. So it may not be that he offered them any sort of smoking gun, but he may have been able to point them in the direction of additional witnesses to speak with who might have that smoking gun.
Jared Kushner wasn't just his son-in-law. Jared Kushner was an active advisor to the president and had a very, very close relationship. Wouldn't Jared Kushner be aware if the president, then President Trump, was trying to put together a group to de facto undermine the election and overthrow the government?
You'd think, but we also know that if we believe the reports, that both Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump were playing a pretty active role on January 6th, trying to get Donald Trump to tell the rioters to go home and to stop the insurrection. And they were not successful on those lines, as we know, along those lines. So it's unclear what they knew and what they were trying to tell the president to do or refrain from doing leading up to that day. I wouldn't be surprised if it was very much those kinds of questions that took up most of the 6 hours.
I want to explore, you look at these races around the country. It appears that in television ratings, the only cable network that had an increase in viewership was Fox News versus CNN and MSNBC and others. Is that an indication of that there's more passion going into the midterms on the Republican side? Or does it mean something else? Better marketing, better billboards in Times Square? What does it tell us?
So certainly it could point to an enthusiasm gap, which we're seeing in polling across the country anyway. Republicans are much more excited than Democrats are about the midterms, largely because the stakes are really high and the Republicans are on the right side, right? They're thinking that if all goes well, or even if only some goes well, they'll likely take back the House, and they've got a very good shot at the Senate. So right from the outset, it's important to realize that the Republicans have a lot to gain, and that makes them more eager to follow what's going on. But the other thing I would note is similar to the way that MSNBC and CNN saw their ratings increase pretty substantially during the Trump administration and then in the aftermath of January 6th, when there was a lot of anti-Trump and anti-Republican news out there. What we're seeing now is a real increase in terms of, the anti-Biden news, and that's because Biden's president. And so Fox can provide more to its viewers than CNN and MSNBC can to its viewers, who are already visiting those channels because they want to be preached to. They are the choir. And
then talk a little bit about sort of what's the mindset of Americans. We see it in what people are reading on GoLocal. They maybe for the first time in a decade, less politics, more food, more summer events, more sort of post-pandemic life information is what people are seeking. They really want to get back to some level of normalcy, and they want to have positive experience with their friends and their family. Are we seeing that around the country? Is there sort of a little bit of a Heisman stiff arm to the world of politics, and most Americans are really looking forward to spring and summer and good weather and concerts outside?
I think so. I think that 2 years into the pandemic and continued discussion about whether we've reached the endemic phase or if the pandemic is still alive and well, if there's going to be another surge. People are tired. COVID fatigue is a real thing. And to the extent that we can move outdoors and have spring and summer, that's what people are looking for. It's also been politics pretty much nonstop for the last 5.5 years. There was the Trump administration, and then from the minute that Joe Biden took over, navigating COVID, dealing with Build Back Better, and now the war in Ukraine, it's just sucking up all of the oxygen and all of the energy. And I think people are exhausted. What that means is that local races, whether they be for mayor, city council, or even House of Representatives, aren't going to get the attention, at least this far out from Election Day, that they might normally.
And then you brought it up, Build Back Better. Build Back Better died. There was I believe there was a burial ceremony. I'm not sure if it was at memorial service and then burial. I'm not sure if it was at Arlington National Cemetery. But the thought process was that the president was then going to take key aspects of it in which there were bipartisan support, submit those as freestanding legislation, and we might have 5 or 6 bills get passed that added up to half, 3/4 of what Build Back Better was. Has any of those steps taken place? Are any of those, significant multi-billion-dollar bills? Have any of those initiatives gotten any momentum, or any of them moving forward?
So I assume that behind the scenes they are, because both the White House and Joe Manchin said in the last week or so that they expect those pieces of legislation to sort of see the light of day in early July. So that leads me to believe that the behind the scenes work is, underway, but it certainly has not been getting a lot of attention. Now, it might be that the Democrats have learned that maybe you shouldn't air your dirty laundry and publicize everything until you actually strike a deal and know that you have the votes. So I'm not sure that we should, read the tea leaves to mean that they're not doing anything. They might have actually learned from a previous mistake. We'll see.
And, corresponding to that, there's not much time on the clock. August recess, people go home to campaign. You're right into the midterm elections. AOC, the sort of focal point of the progressive movement within Congress, had harsh things to say about the condition of the Democratic Party about a week ago. Where are the Democrats? And while the House it's probably lost at the midterms, is the Senate salvageable?
The Senate's salvageable just because the amount of money being poured into the competitive races and the literal division of Democrats and Republicans in those states that have these competitive contests is basically a statistical dead heat. It's a tie. Whether Mark Kelly wins or not, it's a tie. Whether Raphael Warnock is able to hold on to a seat, it's even odds. So, this is a situation where I think for the Senate, it has a little bit, especially in these competitive races, it has a little bit less to do with national tides and more to do with whether people can actually count and can they figure out exactly what the win number is and then make sure that that number of voters gets to the polls.
And the implications for here in Rhode Island, we've got a competitive congressional race in the 2nd congressional with Jim Langevin retiring. It's very infrequent that there's an open seat. You've got a plethora of Democrats running. You've got multiple Republicans. Some Republicans are saying Jessica De La Cruz is going to beat Alan Fung in the Republican primary. Alan Fung is perceived to be the front runner on the Democratic side. You've got Sarah Morgenthau, who's got a lot of money and a lot of contacts in Washington, but literally doesn't live here, and no one in Rhode Island knows who she is. What happens with all of these dynamics playing out here in Rhode Island?
I mean, if I were a betting woman, I would say that there will be a lot of attention to potential upsets or surprises. And at the end of the day, Seth Magaziner and Alan Fung are the nominees for their respective parties. Rarely do you see the kind of shock that, that sort of falls into the category that you've described. Whether that then becomes a very competitive race is at the general election stage, is an open question. It very well could, and that's rare in Rhode Island too. Usually, at least for Congress, the real race is at the primary stage.
Yeah, you haven't seen that since Ron Makeley upset Freddie St. Germain back in 1988, I want to say. And that had a lot of moving pieces to it as well. Scott Wolf did Freddie St. Germain a lot of damage in that Democratic primary, and Ron Makeley was the upset winner of the Republican primary because John Holmes failed to file his papers in time. He was considered the front runner. So lots of moving pieces and dynamics. What should people be looking for over the next week?
Look, I mean, it's basically all eyes on Ukraine still. And I think that over the course of the next week, you know, and I said this last week, I said this the week before, but over the course of the next week, I think we're going to really get a sense of whether there's a ceasefire on the horizon and whether it's likely. Because if Putin is unable to assemble the kind of force that he needs to move forward, we're going to know it in the next few days. If you draft 135,000 Russians and you're still unable to move forward, you have problems. And so I think that we're going to have a better sense of what's going on that front.
Jennifer Lawless, the chair of the Political Science Department at the University of Virginia. As always, thank you very, very much for taking the time to joining us. For everybody else, stay tuned. If you haven't made a donation to 401 Gives, 401gives.org, support your favorite nonprofit here in Rhode Island. It makes a big difference. They all say it. We've had a number of heads of nonprofits on. They just can't say how much this day, the leading day of donations for many, many of these groups. Stay healthy. If you haven't gotten a booster shot, get it. It's going to make you more confident. It's going to make you more healthy. It's going to keep you out of the hospital. But it makes you much more healthier to go out and enjoy Rhode Island this spring, this summer. Thanks, everybody.